Christmas night. While families were praying, singing, and believing the world had paused for a few quiet hours, missiles were already in the air. Not Nigerian missiles. Not Nigerian aircraft. American weapons, launched from a U.S.-based warship sitting calmly in the Gulf of Guinea, crossed borders in silence and struck northern Nigeria. Sokoto. Christmas Day. 16 people dead. Among them, women. Among them, children. That is the fact. Everything else you heard afterward was framing. Within hours, headlines flooded your screen. Precision strike. ISIS. Counter-terrorism operation. When from Mosques. Nigeria provided intelligence support. 1. Have you understood? The words were chosen carefully, because words decide whether a nation feels shock or acceptance. They did not lie about the strike itself. They lied about consent. They lied about control. And most of all, they lied about who had the power to say yes or no. Here is the first truth you need to sit with. This was not a Nigerian decision. Nigeria did not authorize American missiles to cross West African airspace on Christmas night. What Nigeria offered was silence. And silence, when aid is at stake, becomes permission by pressure. You are not supposed to ask that question. You are supposed to feel relieved. You are supposed to hear terrorists and stop thinking. You are supposed to hear Christians under attack and feel moral clarity. That is the hook. That is the shortcut. And that is why this operation happened on Christmas, not in June, not in October, not next year. Timing is not accidental in geopolitics. Timing is messaging. Here is the second truth they hope you never connect. Sokoto is not a religious battlefield. Churches have been attacked there. So have mosques. In November, just weeks before this strike, a mosque was bombed during Friday prayers. 43 worshippers were killed. That story did not trend. That story did not justify missiles, because it did not fit the narrative they needed. And then there is the part that should make you uncomfortable. Among the 16 killed in this precision strike were children. Yet, AFRICOM described the dead as suspected militants. End quote. Tzaka would despise it. That phrase is not a mistake. It is a legal shield. Once someone is labeled a suspect, accountability dissolves. No apology. No compensation. No investigation. Precision, in this language, does not mean accuracy. It means immunity. If this is the first time you are hearing it explained this way, pause for a moment. Remember, the first time you realized mainstream media does not tell the full story about Africa. That moment when something felt off, when the facts did not match the tone. Hold on to that feeling. You will need it. Because the real question is not why the United States bombed Sokoto. The real question is why now? Why Christmas 2024? Why Nigeria and not Mali? Why a naval strike launched from international waters rather than cooperation on the ground? Those answers have nothing to do with terrorism and everything to do with power. Before we go further, I need you to do one thing. If you value analysis that is not filtered for Western comfort, subscribe and turn on notifications. This channel does not survive on algorithms alone. It survives on people who choose truth over convenience. If this video disappears tomorrow, you will know why. What you have just heard is only the surface. In the next chapter, I will show you exactly how BBC, CNN, and Reuters told the same story 3 different ways, and how each version was designed to guide your emotions in a specific direction. Once you see the pattern, you will never unsee it. Chapter 2 is not about missiles. It is about the art of lying without lying. This is how manipulation works in the modern age. Not through lies you can easily catch, but through stories designed to feel familiar, moral, and urgent. The same event happened in Nigeria, yet 3 major outlets told you 3 different versions of it. And somehow, all of them led you to the same conclusion. This was necessary, this was justified, and this was none of your business. Look closely at the language. Strikes to protect Christians, operation against extremists targeting religious minorities, a response to genocide. The word Christian appears again and again, repeated until your brain stops asking questions. That repetition is not accidental. Transforms a geopolitical action into a moral duty. Once something is framed as protection of faith, dissent becomes immoral, questioning becomes offensive, silence becomes compliance. Here is the first pattern they never explain. Violence in northern Nigeria does not follow religious lines. Churches are attacked, mosques are attacked, villages are erased, regardless of belief. In the same region where this strike happened, Muslim worshippers were killed in a mosque weeks earlier. That attack did not trigger international outrage. There was no emergency summit, no threats of missiles, no headlines about genocide, because that story could not be weaponized. This is the art of selective outrage. When violence fits a narrative useful to power, it becomes urgent. When it does not, it becomes invisible. The second pattern is even more dangerous. Media outlets did not ask who authorized the strike. They did not ask which country's airspace was crossed. They did not ask what legal framework allows a foreign navy to launch missiles into West Africa on a religious holiday. Instead, they used soft language that sounds technical but avoids responsibility. Off the coast, in coordination, support. These are not neutral words, they are anesthetics. They dull the sense of violation. And here is the hook you were not meant to notice. When Reuters says off the coast, it sounds distant, almost abstract, but distance does not reduce impact. A missile launched from a ship 1,000 kilometers away still explodes in a village. Precision does not change who buries the dead. There is a reason they do not show you the aftermath. There is a reason they do not linger on the names of the victims, because once you see faces, the narrative collapses. Once you see children labeled as suspected militants, the moral clarity dissolves. Ask yourself this, and do not rush past it. If this operation was purely about saving lives, why was it announced with celebration? Why was it wrapped in political messaging? Why was it delivered as a public warning instead of a quiet security measure? Power that seeks safety moves quietly. Power that seeks dominance makes an example. If you have ever felt anger watching Africa, explained by people who have never lived there, that anger is not irrational, it is recognition. Recognition that the continent is treated as a stage, not a home. As a problem to be managed, not a people to be respected. Pause here and engage. In the comments, write one sentence. Do you believe this strike was about counterterrorism or about control? There is no neutral answer. Choosing not to answer is also a choice. Now, listen carefully, because this is where the story shifts. Everything so far has been about how they tell the story. Headlines, language, framing, omission. But narratives only work if facts are hidden. In the next chapter, we strip away interpretation entirely. No rhetoric, no opinion. Only timelines, official statements, and data from 8 independent sources. And once you see the facts laid out without filters, the question will no longer be whether the story is misleading. The question will be how long this pattern has been repeating, and how many times Africa has paid the price for believing it. Chapter 3 begins where storytelling ends, with evidence. So let us leave the headlines behind. Let us leave emotions, slogans, and moral packaging behind. If the story they told you is true, then the facts should support it. And if the facts do not, then the story collapses under its own weight. Here are the facts, drawn only from official statements, international databases, and institutions that cannot be dismissed as activists or conspiracy theorists. 8 sources, all public, all on record. The United States Africa Command confirmed the strike on December 26. Their wording was precise, calculated, familiar. A precision airstrike targeting operatives of ISIS West Africa province planning imminent attacks. Precision is always the word of choice. It sounds scientific, it sounds clean, it creates distance between the weapon and the bodies it produces. But precision does not mean error-free. It means the target was chosen deliberately. And that distinction matters. Now look at the second fact. Reuters confirmed the strike was launched from a U.S.-based naval vessel positioned off the coast of Guinea. Single sentence should have stopped the conversation. A warship outside one country launches weapons into another, crossing multiple sovereign airspaces. That is not a technical detail. That is the core issue. Yet no outlet asked the obvious question, who authorized passage through those skies? Silence answers that question louder than denial. The third fact comes from the Nigeria government itself. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs stated that Nigeria provided intelligence support, not authorization, not joint command, not operational control. Intelligence support. That phrase is carefully chosen. It signals cooperation without ownership, assistance without consent, and in international law, that distinction is everything. Intelligence does not grant permission to strike. It only reduces plausible deniability. Here is where the fourth fact breaks the moral narrative. Independent reporting, including confirmations by Sky News and BBC, acknowledged civilian casualties, 16 dead. Among them, women, among them, children. Yet in the same breath, those civilians were described as suspected militants. Suspicion, once attached, becomes a shield against accountability. A 7-year-old no longer needs a name, only a label. Now, step back and look at the fifth fact provided by ACLED, the most widely cited conflict data source in the world. Over the last 6 months in Sokoto state, attacks did not target one religion. They targeted villages. They targeted roads. They targeted markets. More than 40% of victims were civilians with no affiliation to any armed group. The data does not support a religious war. It supports state failure. Human Rights Watch adds the sixth fact. Civilian casualties in counter-terrorism operations in Nigeria have tripled since 2022. Not decreased, not stabilized, tripled. That includes operations conducted with international partners. If foreign intervention was solving the problem, this trend would not exist. The seventh fact comes from the International Crisis Group, which warned that increased foreign military involvement in the Sahel risks repeating the Libya scenario. Short-term tactical gains, followed by long-term collapse. That warning was issued before Libya disintegrated. It was ignored then. It is being ignored now. And the eighth fact is the one no missile can erase. According to UN displacement data, thousands of civilians fled surrounding areas in the days following the strike. They did not flee ISIS. They fled uncertainty. They fled the knowledge that their sky no longer belongs to them. Pause here. If these facts surprise you, that is not because they were hidden, it is because they were buried. Buried under moral framing, buried under selective language. Buried under repetition, designed to exhaust your skepticism. This is your moment to act, not emotionally, but intellectually. Share this video with one person who still believes the narrative at face value. One, not to argue, to plant doubt. Doubt is the beginning of independence. Now, understand this before we move forward. None of these facts deny the existence of terrorism. None of them excuse violence by armed groups. But facts do expose something far more uncomfortable. This was not simply a security operation. It was a message, a demonstration, a reminder of who controls the air. And that realization brings us to the question that cannot be avoided any longer. Why now? Why Nigeria? Why Christmas? Why this precise moment in history? The answer is not in Sokoto. It is not in Washington. It is not in ISIS. It is in the global struggle for Africa itself. And that is where this story goes next. Chapter 4 begins with the clock that is ticking for the entire continent. Now that you have the facts, the question changes. It is no longer whether the strike happened or whether civilians died. The real question is timing. Because in geopolitics, timing is never accidental. Power does not move randomly. It moves when the cost of delay becomes greater than the risk of action. This strike did not happen because of Sokoto alone. It happened because the global balance is shifting, and Africa is no longer behaving the way it used to. Here is the first truth you are not supposed to connect. The world is moving away from a single center of power. Decades, decisions were made in one direction and followed everywhere else. That era is ending. New alliances are forming. Old hierarchies are cracking. And Africa, for the first time in generations, is not automatically choosing sides. That terrifies those who built their dominance on predictability. In the last 3 years, African governments have started saying no. No to permanent foreign bases, no to one-sided security agreements, no to political lectures attached to loans. When that happens once, it is an exception. When it happens across a region, it becomes a threat. That brings us to the second truth. The Sahel is no longer a passive corridor. It is becoming a strategic wall. Countries once treated as buffer zones are now coordinating militarily, economically, and diplomatically without asking permission. They are closing ranks. They are sharing intelligence with each other, not with outsiders. And they are rewriting the rules of cooperation on their own terms. When that happens, pressure must be applied somewhere else. Not where resistance is strongest, but where uncertainty still exists. That is where Nigeria enters the picture. Nigeria is not just another country. It is the largest population on the continent, the biggest economy in West Africa, and a psychological anchor for the region. If Nigeria shifts, the entire balance shifts with it. If Nigeria resists, others hesitate. If Nigeria complies, resistance becomes isolated. That is why this strike matters. It was not only about eliminating militants, it was about demonstrating reach, about reminding everyone watching that even without bases, even without troops on the ground, the sky can still be controlled. It was a signal wrapped in moral language, delivered with military precision, and timed for maximum visibility. Christmas was not chosen for symbolism alone. It was chosen because attention was guaranteed, because silence would be framed as approval, because questioning it would be painted as defending the indefensible. That is the third truth. Moral framing is not decoration, it is a weapon. When violence is packaged as protection, debate collapses. When sovereignty is reframed as inconvenience, resistance sounds irresponsible. And when Africa is spoken about instead of listened to, decisions are made without consequence. Here is the mini-hook most people miss. This strike did not strengthen Nigeria, it exposed its vulnerability. A state confident in its sovereignty does not allow ambiguity about who controls its airspace. A state under pressure accepts cooperation that quietly redefines control. And once that line is crossed, it becomes easier to cross again. Ask yourself this, and do not answer quickly. If this strike sets a precedent, what comes next? Temporary access becomes routine. Intelligence sharing becomes operational control. Occasional strikes become standing authority. This is not speculation. This is the pattern, repeated across continents, across decades. This is where you come in. If you live in Africa, understand this. What happens in Nigeria never stays in Nigeria. It spreads. Precedents migrate faster than armies. If you live in the diaspora, understand this. Narratives formed today become policies tomorrow. Silence now becomes justification later. This is not the moment to argue about personalities or parties. This is the moment to recognize structure. Power is repositioning itself. Africa is no longer invisible. And visibility always comes with pressure. Here is your action. Share this chapter, not because it is dramatic, but because it is strategic. One share disrupts, one algorithmic bubble. Enough disruption changes what questions get asked. And now, we move from systems to memory. Because none of this is new. This exact pattern has appeared before. Different country, different excuse, same outcome. And the dead always tell the truth, even when the living refuse to listen. That is where we go next. Chapter 5 is not speculation. It is history speaking back. History does not repeat itself, but it leaves fingerprints. And if you have been paying attention, you are staring at the same fingerprints again. Libya, Afghanistan, Mali. Different names, different excuses, same sequence. The pattern is so consistent that denying it now requires effort. First comes moral language, humanitarian concern, action of civilians, counterterrorism, then comes air power, precision strikes, limited engagement, then comes silence, followed by collapse, not immediately, slowly. Institutions weaken, militias multiply, borders dissolve. And finally, the question everyone pretends not to ask, who benefited? Let's start with Libya. In 2011, NATO said Muammar Gaddafi was about to massacre his own people. The world was told intervention was urgent, unavoidable, righteous. The bombs fell, Gaddafi was killed. And the cameras moved on. What followed was not democracy, it was fragmentation. 3 rival governments, open-air slave markets, weapons flooding the Sahel, terrorist networks expanding south. Libya did not fall in isolation. It detonated instability across an entire region. Now, ask yourself this. If the goal was to protect civilians, why did civilian deaths increase after intervention? If the goal was stability, why did chaos become permanent? And if the goal was freedom, why did Libyans lose control over their own territory? Here is the uncomfortable detail most reports avoid. In the months before the bombing, Libya was pushing for a Pan-African gold-backed currency. A system designed to reduce dependence on the US dollar and the euro. That project died with Gaddafi. Gold prices surged. Western financial dominance remained intact. Coincidence is a convenient word, but it explains very little. Move to Afghanistan. 20 years, $2 trillion, hundreds of thousands of lives. The justification changed constantly. Terrorism, women's rights, democracy, but the outcome never changed. When the last plane left Kabul, the Taliban walked back into power. Nothing fundamental shifted, except a number of graves. Intervention created motion, not resolution. Then Mali. France entered under Operation Serval, promising to crush jihadist groups. A decade later, terrorism had expanded, not shrunk. Civilian casualties rose, public trust collapsed. And when Mali finally expelled foreign forces, the West called it irresponsible. But here is the real question. If intervention was working, why did Mali feel the need to remove it? Now, place Nigeria into this sequence. A Christmas airstrike, foreign missiles, civilian deaths, media justification. And the same quiet assumption that this is normal, acceptable, even helpful. That is the real danger. Not the strike itself, but the normalization of it. Because once a precedent is set, it does not stay contained. If Nigeria's airspace can be violated without consequence, so can Kenya's, so can Ghana's, so can Ethiopia's. The lesson history teaches is simple. Silence today becomes permission tomorrow. If this pattern makes you uncomfortable, it should. That discomfort is clarity arriving late, and clarity demands action, not applause. If you believe Africa cannot keep repeating the same tragedy under new slogans, write, "I see the pattern" in the comments. Not for me, for visibility, for each other. And stay with me, because history is not the end of this story. It is the warning. What matters now is how living Africans respond. That brings us to the most uncomfortable question of all, where you stand in this moment, and what the cost of your silence really is. At this point, the question is no longer what happened in Nigeria. The real question is where you stand in it, because history is not moved by missiles alone. It is moved by silence. And silence is never neutral. Every major intervention in Africa followed the same psychological script. First, you are told it is none of your business. Then you are told it is too complex. Then you are told to trust the experts. And finally, when the damage is done, you are told it is too late. That is how responsibility is quietly erased. Here is the truth most people avoid. Sovereignty does not disappear in one dramatic moment. It erodes in small concessions. One intelligence sharing agreement, one temporary operation, one exception made in the name of security. And then one day, you wake up and realize decisions about your land, your airspace, and your people are being made elsewhere. Ask yourself something simple. If a foreign power can strike targets inside Nigeria without a public authorization process, who actually controls Nigerian airspace? Accountability disappears the moment civilians are killed. Who bears responsibility? And if no one is held accountable, what stops it from happening again? This is not abstract. 16 people are dead, families displaced, villages emptied, yet the dominant conversation is still about optics, messaging, and diplomacy, not justice, not consent, not ownership of the outcome. That tells you everything you need to know about whose lives are prioritized. Here is the part that should unsettle you most. Once intervention becomes routine, it stops being questioned, and once it stops being questioned, it becomes policy. Policy becomes structure. Structure becomes permanence. That is how emergency measures quietly turn into long-term control. If you live in Africa, this moment is closer to you than you think, because today it is Nigeria, tomorrow it is another fragile state, another hot zone, another justification wrapped in moral language. The geography changes. The logic does not. If you live in the diaspora, this moment still belongs to you, because distance does not erase consequence. Decisions made on African soil shape migration flows, economic instability, and generational trauma that follow people across borders. You cannot disconnect from a continent and still claim its identity only when it feels comfortable. There is a reason these conversations rarely happen openly, because once people start asking who authorizes violence, who profits from instability, and who pays the price, the narrative collapses. That is why distraction is constant, outrage cycles are short, memory is discouraged. So let me ask you directly, not as a viewer, not as an observer, as a participant, what does your silence communicate? Because silence is not empty, it signals permission. It signals acceptance. It signals that the cost will be paid by someone else. If this analysis reflects something you have felt, but never articulated, write, "I am paying attention" in the comments. That single act matters more than you think. Algorithms measure engagement, but movements measure presence. And stay with me, because this is where the conversation becomes personal. Not geopolitical, not theoretical, personal. Because once you understand the pattern, the next question is unavoidable. If this keeps happening, and you keep watching, what role are you actually playing? That question leads us to the next chapter, not about governments, not about armies, but about people who refuse to look away once they understand what is at stake. If you are still here, that fact alone already separates you from most people. It means something in this story refused to let you go. It means you did not treat this as background noise. And that matters, because power relies on one thing more than weapons or money. It relies on indifference. There are two kinds of audiences in moments like this, those who watch to be entertained, and those who watch because they recognize themselves in the consequences. If you are still listening, you are not neutral anymore. Neutrality ends the moment understanding begins. Let me speak plainly now. What you have seen is not a tragedy caused by chaos. It is a system that functions exactly as designed. Violence is framed as necessity. Civilian deaths are softened into statistics. Sovereignty is reduced to a talking point, and the public is trained to move on before accountability can even be asked. Here is the uncomfortable truth. Every system that dominates Africa today survives because enough people convince themselves they are powerless. That belief is more effective than censorship. Because when people believe nothing they do matters, they stop doing anything at all. If you live on the continent, you have been told your entire life that change must come from outside, from donors, from peacekeepers, from advisors, from institutions with acronyms. Yet every time those forces arrive, the instability deepens. That is not coincidence. Dependency is not a failure of the system. It is the system. If you live in the diaspora, you carry a different burden. You see Africa discussed in rooms where no African voice is present. You hear policies debated as abstractions. You watch headlines turn your birthplace into a case study. And slowly, you are expected to choose comfort over truth, silence over memory, acceptance over resistance. Is a question you should not ignore. If Africa is always portrayed as incapable of governing itself, who benefits from that belief? Because that narrative does not exist to describe reality. It exists to justify control. This is why education alone is not enough. Awareness alone is not enough. Understanding without action simply creates informed spectators. History is not changed by spectators. It is changed by people who refuse to accept the story they are given. That does not mean violence. It does not mean chaos. It means refusing to repeat lies. It means challenging framing. It means asking who decides, who profits, and who pays. Over and over again, until those questions become unavoidable. So here is the line you must cross. Either you treat this as another disturbing video and move on, or you accept that knowing creates responsibility. Once you see the pattern, you do not get to unknow it. If this chapter speaks directly to you, do not scroll past it quietly. Write in the comments where you are watching from. Write one sentence that names what you refuse to accept anymore. That is not symbolic. That is how communities recognize themselves. Because the final chapter is not about analysis, it is about choice. And choice is where power either changes hands or stays exactly where it is. What comes next is the hardest part of this conversation, not because it is complicated, but because it removes the last excuse. The excuse that this is someone else's fight. That is where we go next. Let me be absolutely clear, because clarity is the most dangerous thing in moments like this. This is not a call to defend terrorists. This is not an attack on any nation's people. And it is not a plea for sympathy. This is about one word. The global system is terrified to say out loud when Africa is involved: sovereignty. Sovereignty does not mean perfection. It does not mean the absence of violence or corruption or failure. Sovereignty means one thing only: that decisions about a country's future are made by the people who live with the consequences. The moment that principle is compromised, every justification that follows becomes easier. Precision strikes, strategic partnerships, security cooperation. Each phrase sounds reasonable on its own. Together, they form a permission slip for permanent intervention. Here is the mini-hook they never want you to notice. Terrorism did not create foreign military presence in Africa. Foreign military presence created the conditions terrorism thrives in. Where states lose control, armed groups fill the vacuum. Where dignity is stripped, recruitment becomes easy. Where economic futures are stolen, violence becomes currency. The solution, despite what you are told, is a boring one. Strong institutions, regional cooperation on equal terms, security forces accountable to civilians, not donors. Education that produces engineers, not just aid proposals. Jobs that offer dignity, not dependency. None of this trends on television. None of it fits into a breaking news headline. But every society that escaped permanent instability did so through these exact steps. Here is another truth rarely spoken. No external power will ever build these systems for Africa, not because they cannot, but because they should not. And because a self-governing Africa is incompatible with an extractive global order. This is the final question you must answer for yourself. Do you want Africa to remain an object of history, managed, interpreted, and intervened upon? Or do you want Africa to be a subject of history, deciding, negotiating, and defending its own future? If you choose the first, nothing is required of you. Keep scrolling, keep consuming, keep waiting for the next crisis to explain why nothing changes. But if you choose the second, neutrality is no longer an option. Action does not begin with marches or slogans. It begins with language, with refusing to repeat lazy narratives, with correcting misinformation in your own circles, with supporting African-led solutions, not imported saviors, with demanding transparency from African governments and refusing dependency disguised as partnership. Here is what I ask of you, and it is deliberate. Write the words, "I stand with African sovereignty" in the comments, not for me, for the algorithm. Visibility is power in the digital age, and silence is how stories are buried. Share this video with one person who still believes Africa's problems must be solved from outside. If you are still here, subscribe, not as a favor, but as a commitment, because the next conversation will be harder than this one. We will talk about money, about debt, about who really controls African economies long after the soldiers leave. This Christmas strike was not the end of a story. It was the beginning of a choice, and history does not care how loudly you felt about it, only where you stood. I am Ibrahim. I do not apologize for truth, and I refuse to pretend this was inevitable.